So yeah, thank you so much. I'm Ray Crisatello. I do thankfully know a lot of you now, at least a little bit. I'm the Deputy Director of Research at SEIU United Healthcare Workers West. I'm in Oakland, but we're a statewide local. And we have about 100,000 allied healthcare workers across California. And I feel really lucky to be part of a local that's committed to making deep investments and taking not insignificant risks in pushing forward this model of unionized co-op work in the healthcare space. I don't want to take up too much time with background, but on the other hand, outside of describing Allied Up and the kind of how we got to the actual co-op, I do think that there is useful background just to sort of start off on the same page. So I do want to get into history behind my union's incubation of worker-owned entities, because it gives a sense of the risks and investments that happen at various stages and how to negotiate them. Then I'll talk a little bit about the healthcare workers staffing co-op that was kind of the pilot predecessor to the bigger one, Allied Up, that we launched a few months ago, and some learnings along the way. And this is all specific to healthcare workers since that's my world, but I do think it can be applied to other industries. And I like to think about how to really scale this model, especially across sectors. And then finally, I did want to touch on some legislative and policy innovations that I've developed and that other people I hope will undertake to help create ease and incentive for these sorts of employment models to take up a bigger space in our economy. So for background, well, it feels recent, but I guess it was actually like 6 years ago that we, as a strategic arm of the union, we kind of were given leeway to start thinking about how to help our union members navigate a lot of different work-life issues, dynamics they were expressing concern and frustration over that were, again, not particular to healthcare. But the sad reality is that those forces are not only still here 6 years later, but a lot of them have intensified during the pandemic. So things like in healthcare, changing scopes of practice that kind of push healthcare workers into jobs that feel less meaningful and don't really reflect why they went into healthcare in the first place. Constant attempt by hospital employers to contract work out, especially in low wage work like janitorial and food service. Lack of control over work in all sorts of different ways. The infiltration of the gig economy into nursing jobs and patient-facing jobs. So initially, I was setting out to kind of advise our union about a large-scale systemic way, not to just force proper classification of contract workers, but to create a more asset-rich and benefit-rich environment for healthcare workers where they could regain that control over their work lives a bit. So I looked at, there's nothing new here. Obviously, co-ops are not new, and none of the things I looked at were new, although there were sort of some new versions like platform co-ops, for example. But hiring halls, registries, these are all like, deep and old parts of labor history. But I sort of, tried to look at all these different models and became convinced that developing worker co-ops and specifically staffing platform co-ops with a union partnership was the most meaningful large-scale solution to the problems that we were hearing from our members. And there, at the time it was sort of, there were theoretical solutions there. Those theoretical solutions became actual once this LVN pilot co-op happened, and that helped internally. It kind of helped, sell the idea that this really was worthwhile and powerful. And yeah, I'll say upfront too that combining unions and worker ownership can seem duplicative or counterintuitive. And I obviously don't think that that's true, but it's a question that comes up a lot. Union representation and worker ownership can complement each other, I think, in ways that are really important, injecting worker voice and accountability at multiple levels. A union gives non-managerial workers collective power to bargain with management and hold them accountable. It's not like some people think bargaining with yourself. Like in practice, that is not how it feels. It just feels like a more natural alignment of values. Worker ownership obviously ensures that workers receive a share of the gains their labor creates. And in the case of co-ops, expands democratic control that workers have over the uses to which their labor is put. So union, and there's growing examples of union involvement in worker ownership, which can look like a lot of things. Supporting development of startup co-ops like we've done. Aside from startups, there are also opportunities for recuperated workspaces, public campaigns to win a deal with a hostile owner, which are interesting, cooperative development in sectors where legislation or policy undermines workers' ability to unionize. So like gig workers, for example, is the obvious place where that's happening. And negotiating conversions to worker ownership of existing firms with an organized workforce. So I think, worker ownership can appeal to unions seeking alternative organizing paths when closures or ownership transitions can otherwise result in loss of union jobs, when seeking an alternative to, like, for example, relentless outsourcing. And I think union representation combined with worker ownership can deepen member engagement. I've seen that happen. It can stabilize career pathways, create access to wage growth, improve quality of work life. Increasingly important here, reducing turnover and burnout, promote employment models that are accountable to the workers, to the communities where they're working, and also have sort of a stabilizing factor with organized labor's values in a way that builds trust. Let's see how much more detail to give here about. All right, I will give just a really quick, just so we're kind of on the same page about structures themselves. So I didn't list on here platform co-ops, but there's a number of forms of co-ops that I do think are kind of key to just like picture in your mind when you think about workforce models that assemble workers that do, hold both labor and capital for the workers. So the first, probably most obvious one or commonly understood is worker co-ops. So that's simply a business entity that's owned and controlled by the workers. It is helpful to think about it as stock or shares, like who owns the shares and who owns the governance. So this is obviously in contrast to a conventional privately held company, where there'd generally be a group of founders who own the majority of the company's stock, serve on a board, serve as the company's executive team, and that group normally would retain profits for themselves. So in contrast, in a worker co-op, the shares are not just held by that select group of managers or supervisors or whoever, but all workers who have met a certain basic eligibility requirement. The worker owners, generally the mantra is like one worker, one vote. Worker owners on a one member, one vote basis elect the board who oversees the management, who in turn oversee the worker owners. So there's a accountability loop that starts and ends with workers. In a consumer co-op, so think like REI or maybe a grocery co-op if you shop at one, is a co-op owned by the people who buy from the cooperative. So these can provide basically anything that people would want. Groceries, electricity, banking, healthcare, schools, housing. There's a really interesting conversation about public utility co-ops now that with PG&E and wildfire stuff in California. So compared to a worker co-op, usually consumer co-ops are able to raise a lot more money. I'll give an example of this later through membership, because there's usually a large pool of consumers willing to pay something like even $1,000 a share for membership access. Whereas in a worker co-op, it's usually a smaller number of workers who might pay something like $100 a share. But anyway, it's mostly because consumer co-ops are usually organized by consumers who want high quality goods and services and are willing to pay more for them. Credit unions are the most widely used co-ops in the US, which are consumer co-ops for banking, obviously. Multi-stakeholder co-ops, also called hybrid or solidarity co-ops, are co-ops that are where there's more than one class of members. So for example, there's a food co-op in Sonoma County that has 3 classes of owners workers, farmers, and consumers. And each of those classes of members can have different rights to participate in the surplus or profits of the company. You can have different rules around the governance, the membership fee, roles, and decision making. So there is problems or opportunities there with how you structure it that can be different than just like one worker, one vote, because there are different classes. And then producer, purchasing, and marketing co-ops are kind of the ones that people don't realize are co-ops, like Ace Hardware or Carpet One or Best Western. These are co-ops formed to increase efficiency in purchasing supplies or providing services. So there's a fun one in Maine of lobster fishermen that uses like pooled production and marketing so that private enterprises of lobster fisher people, for example, can collectivize those expenses and then sell through the co-op. And agriculture is obviously the big space for this. So producer co-ops are the most commonly found co-op form for agriculture in the US. It's something like 30% of total agriculture production in the US is marketed by co-ops. So in terms, a little more about like the mechanics of getting into creating a co-op, I guess, yeah, so practical thoughts about incorporating. It's not like some mystical thing, although after doing it a few times, it feels like helpful to repeat it to people so that it is more widely done and used. There's of course co-op attorneys that can incorporate and give advice around this. Yeah, so a key sort of deciding point in what legal form to choose in incorporating is how you want to limit the liability of workers. What are the workers doing? How do you want to protect them? In what ways? And how incorporating can provide a meaningful pool for the workers' resources into a separate legal structure. There are some interesting examples of co-ops and joint ventures and trusts being used to, for example, separate intellectual property from labor pools, to separate training and education from the capital raise sort of engine of the startup. So there's some really fun and complex startup questions in terms of like corporate formation at the very front. You can create a separate taxpayer from the workers. If you want to have a pool of workers that include people with mixed immigration status, there are things to figure out there. And how, maybe most importantly, how you use the corporate form to preserve the mission of the corporation over time. In California, you can incorporate a co-op in any corporate form. So cooperative corporation, partnership, S Corp, whatever, which is useful. There's a statute in California, AB 816, the California Worker Cooperative Act, which is somewhat recent. It's like 6 years old. And it provides for a business entity specifically for worker co-ops under what was already the existing Consumer Cooperative Corporations Law. And if you see in California, if you see something that actually has the word cooperative in the title, that is the only way you have to incorporate under this part of the statute. Otherwise, you cannot use the word cooperative. And a key feature of 816 is also that it relaxed barriers to raising investment capital. It creates a securities exemption for registration for the sale of membership up to $1,000. It had been $300. So there's an opportunity to create more startup capital there. And it also mandates worker control. So there's a definition that embeds true democratic worker control in the definition of a cooperative. Let's see. The next, the next kind of big steps in co-op creation have to do with developing the bylaws, which are, it's obviously the governance structure and stock structure of the company. So this is where, for the co-ops we developed, we spent a lot of time. And there are kind of clever ways to kick the can a little bit and create a bit of boilerplate bylaws and then defer down the road to a board that might decide on how to do something. But it has been my experience so far that kind of embedding the most important and deepest values that are found in the bylaws up front is really helpful, especially since there might be turnover in board and member engagement, and you kind of want to really deeply embed what it is what it is you want the corporate form to hold essentially in perpetuity. The bylaws are really the architecture of the co-op. So typically, it's been helpful to think about governance as being like the accountability of the business entity to the worker owners. Traditionally, it's represented by a board of directors that's elected, again, on a one member, one vote basis. And governance is not unlike a C3, deals with long-term strategic decision-making about the fundamental nature of the co-op and the work that it's doing in the world. And then structurally, big questions like membership, capital, debt structure. Other steps, including in that kind of world, are about designing the capital account structure. How are people actually going to hold their assets in the co-op? And then once the bylaws are in place, they're sort of just the startup functions of basically any enterprise about getting the right people in place, getting managers, scaling up payroll, admin functions, things like that, hiring workers, and actually, doing the job of the co-op. And I did want to mention too that there are incubators. I have not done this personally, but I have relied on some consultants who do this work normally, that a co-op incubator can coordinate all of that sort of startup stuff that I've described, but that involves releasing a lot of control, which may not, and in the case of union development, was not appealing. But co-op incubators, like some of these here, can be useful in early business development and are used pretty widely. So raising capital, so I had to think through all of these options, and as would anybody, having to think about how to actually capitalize even a small co-op up front. There are separate complicated questions about a union doing this, since a union cannot technically create an employer. But in terms of the capital raise questions that came ahead of the LVN co-op, and then later had to raise money for the Allied Up, the larger healthcare worker staffing co-op. These are the kind of big categories. So member financing or Class A stock, that's when members join a co-op, they usually make an initial capital contribution. That's their purchase of their single share. And they can really vary in amount. In the case of the healthcare workers staffing co-ops, we've kept the buy-in low. There's sort of a tension between wanting people to have skin in the game, and people can of course pay it off over time. You don't have to just pay it up front in one amount. On the other hand, for like licensed vocational nurses, for example, that were the first set of workers we did this with, you don't want to have an outsized investment for people's income. So I think the buy-in there was $250, and the buy-in at Allied Up, I think, is $350, and people can pay it off over a set of months. But just to give an example, so it's not like you're raising a huge amount of money if your first set of workers, in our case, is maybe 40 something, but our goal for this current co-op is to scale to many thousands. So you can raise not insignificant money through Class A stock. And in terms of the capital accounts, this is kind of the house of the membership stock. So Class A member financing is the capital account is like the key capital feature of the co-op. So an internal capital account is comprised of money that's lent by a member essentially to the co-op. So it includes that initial capital contribution when they join, as well as earnings that members reinvest in the co-op over time. So many worker co-ops require that capital contribution. Some don't, but functionally, the internal capital account brings the banking function within the co-op. So members could also deposit their money at a financial institution, which then lends it back to the co-op. The internal capital account cuts out that financial intermediary. So Class B preferred shares is one way to raise more significant amounts of money. So in addition to the shares for the primary members, cooperatives can sell shares with limited voting rights in the form of preferred stock. So unlike traditional common stock, preferred stock does not increase in value over time. It pays a dividend at the discretion of the board. But there's a tension between allowing outside investment while preventing that investment from influencing voting rights. So co-ops usually almost always want to limit the voting rights of preferred shareholders. When we were doing this for the healthcare worker co-ops, we didn't want preferred shareholders to have any voting rights over anything other than huge changes like dissolution or something like a really serious, huge corporate shift. But other than that, so that obviously limits investment. There have to be really socially motivated investors because you're not getting any of the sort of normal return or normal anything that you would get in a term sheet for a regular stock. Direct public offerings. I've not done this, but I researched a lot to figure out if this is something we did want to do. Co-ops can use certain securities rules to make an investment offering to the public. It's just exactly what it sounds like. CDFIs are banks chartered to serve mission-driven entities like co-ops. So people probably have heard of some of the big ones like Capital Impact Partners and Working World. And CDFIs increasingly, it seems like, are partnering with some of those co-op incubator developer organizations to leverage funding for specific projects, which can be a useful partnership to walk into if you're looking for advice about raising money. Social impact investing, crowdfunding. There's that AB 816 created a special type of crowdfunding exemption only for worker co-ops. So you can do a direct public offering to raise. There's a limit though. It's a little over $1 million using a registered crowdfunding platform, and you have to do it within 12 months. Pure financing. This is like somewhat limited. There's not huge amounts of money in this, but co-ops, some co-ops devote a portion of their profits for investment in other co-ops, like Rainbow Grocery does this. And then there's traditional financing and philanthropic and government funding. And I'd say in the philanthropic and government funding areas are where union partnership has been particularly powerful as an ally in connecting and making relationships. Okay, so on to the actual co-ops. So the LVN co-op, this was the pilot project that I was describing that really kind of got my union on board with trying to scale this. We licensed vocational nurses, we have about 13,000 of them in our union. And it's probably not by chance that we have a fair number of them in our executive and leadership board. I don't know what it is exactly, but they're particularly entrepreneurial, mostly women of color, really smart. And a lot of them sort of have multiple jobs and kind of game staffing systems already and are just very thoughtful. So anyway, they came to us, a set of LVNs in our union came to us basically saying, we're having these nightmare problems where we basically have to start working in long-term care and do kinds of work we don't want to be doing. We're being pushed out of the hospital. In Northern California, more than Southern, LVNs have really been pushed out of hospitals, partly because, somewhat ironically, the nurses union has been very good at getting such strict RN staffing ratios that RNs are replacing LVNs in a lot of places. Anyway, so this is the first co-op that we helped launch, and there were some sort of immediate lessons that came out that were really positive. So the natural alignment that I was kind of describing before about the success of the co-op being tied to the success of the union, there being like a cohesive identity of interest and alignment between the workers and the organization as a whole, really came to the surface. That workers in co-ops share in the company's profits in a way that stays with the membership instead of being like skimmed by the boss, as most workers are used to. Co-ops over time, this wasn't immediately clear, it's more clear now, are really good at protecting worker wages, benefits, working conditions, hours, like the normal kind of incentive of organized labor. And it didn't happen with the LVN co-op. It is starting to happen now with Allied Up, because you really need scale for this. But the union can give the co-op workers access to tremendous pooled benefits that smaller co-ops alone could never access. So pension, health, other retirement, things like that. And I'll say also access to training and education funds, which can be leveraged at a huge scale through unions, are so powerful. And combining that with a co-op, I think, is a really, really interesting and meaningful partnership. So yeah, and it enhanced political power in legislative and policy arenas, I'd say, similarly by collectivizing the voice of workers in similarly minded co-ops that otherwise kind of don't have any sort of political engine. There's definitely more possibilities for flexibility and entrepreneurship that I've seen with a co-op employer that's unionized than a non-co-op employer. This ability to build capital in a private account is also a separate engine for retirement and savings that can be meaningful for union workers. And especially during the pandemic, solving for high turnover and stressful work lives. In our case, we've become very frustrated by the hospital and healthcare staffing industry, which has focused to a gross degree on shareholder and executive profits over worker wealth building, health and safety, and patient outcomes. So this is really an antidote to that. Just to describe like kind of what happened with the LVN co-op. So the idea was to build this is again from the LVNs. They wanted a lower cost mobilized team of LVNs to do home visits, either on demand or scheduled. They didn't really care, but they specifically wanted to see patients in their homes, low income patients, and were convinced, this is like way pre-pandemic, but that a lot of access barriers could be overcome by offering home visits, and LVN scope of practice, like what they normally do, does not require being in a hospital or clinic space usually. So the co-op made sense a co-op structure made sense for a lot of reasons. They wanted an employer of record. They did not want to be 1090. They didn't want to be independent contractors. They wanted to recruit LVNs from communities that they were serving to align cultural competence and language skills. And from the perspective of a hospital or clinic using the LVN co-op for staffing labor, the co-op can contain cost, risk, and liability, which ended up being appealing to clinics that we talked to. And from the perspective of the clinics trying to reach certain populations, overcoming those barriers for low-income communities were really meaningful. So like lack of transportation, lack of childcare, inflexible work schedules, housing instability. So as a result of those hurdles, a lot of patients weren't scheduling certain types of visits. When we would talk with clinics and health systems about like, where would this be a good fit? They were trying to solve for particular populations with those particular barriers. So the union, we basically, used, or, I don't know, it's not like a bad thing, but leveraged our employer relationships to say like, we have a partnership with this staffing co-op, like, will you meet with them? And we would meet jointly sometimes, or sometimes the board of the co-op would just do it by themselves. They had hired managers. So they had plenty of professional expertise too. And ultimately the union, not the union, the co-op created a partnership with St. John's Well Child and Family Clinic in South Los Angeles. They hired 22 bilingual LVNs, and they unionized with UHW. So St. John's partnered with the co-op and launched this project to create better health access for the patient population. Here was CPSP, which is Comprehensive Perinatal Services Program, which is a set of 12 visits for pregnant women on Medi-Cal that are linked to better health outcomes for both the mom and baby. And St. John's and a lot of clinics have a really hard time getting people to come in for 12 visits during a pregnancy for pretty obvious reasons. So the partnership allowed the call center for St. John's to say, we're trying to set up this, your CPSP visits, instead of just like, when can you come in? Do you want an LVN to come to your house? And it was pretty incredible. So they had, by most measures, or by any measure I could think of, it was successful. Like the appointment adhesion rate it had been terrible. They had a 50% cancellation rate before that got down to below 10%. They increased the number of average visits by 50%. The fewer than 1% of the visits required a call to the supervising physician. A key piece of the LVN co-op is that the LVN in California, LVNs are the highest sort of patient-facing nursing classification that can be supervised remotely. So by a physician, so that remote supervision and ability to call for supervision if you need it remotely creates a patient encounter that's billable. So each of these was billable by the clinic. And this is certainly not why they were doing it, but it did create, each of the visits created revenue for the clinic. So, so then we were sort of beyond the proof of concept internally, which is a very important relational and political piece in unions to kind of get the leadership elected and staff leadership like on board. So we had kind of full buy-in after the LVN co-op that for any imaginable healthcare worker classification who is dealing with sort of the world of staffing agencies, we could create a more asset-rich alternative by kind of expanding the LVN co-op idea. So, so that is what became what's now Allied Up. So part of the labor supply for Allied Up, aside from just healthcare workers who are interested in working through the co-op, comes from a privileged relationship with Futuro Health, which is a nonprofit training and education program that the union, it's a fund that the union negotiated through our last round of collective bargaining with Kaiser. It was initially $130 million over 4 years. That'll be revisited in a couple of years when the CBA is open again. But so the Futuro Health kind of pipeline is that newly credentialed healthcare workers coming out of Futuro Health programs. This could be like medical assisting, LVN, phlebotomy, a lot of tech classifications like respiratory tech and pharmacy tech. Those folks coming out of those programs, instead of just being like released into the market, can transition to work through placements through the co-op. So there's also kind of like a, it's the training to career pathway. And it's, sort of a cheap word, but it's like branded the whole way along too as a like co-op union partnership. And that sort of identity does seem like an important piece of this, which I'll say has shown up already because, well, maybe, I don't know, this is how I read it. There's now like 44 workers in the co-op. There might be more, that's like the last I checked, but 6 of them already were offered after their 13 weeks or whatever their placement was, were offered, leave the staffing agency, come work directly for us. And all of them said no. They all want to keep working for the co-op. So I think there's something there. So the Allied Up's mission is to provide excellent healthcare to patients high quality service to clients, and meaningful employment and ownership to workers. The ownership is the key piece, clearly. And Allied Up is targeting the 5 largest metropolitan areas in California that are experiencing supply gaps. So the co-op is aiming to pay its workers $3 to $5 more per hour than the staffing industry average, in part to resolve retention challenges faced by traditional staffing firms. And also, in contrast to traditional staffing firms, Allied Up is providing above market pay, but also benefits like employer paid medical, dental, vision, paid time off, opportunities for wealth building, and access to education upskilling through its partnership with the Union Labor Management Trust. And Allied Up is structured to allow workers to accrue hours for benefits regardless of if they might be working at multiple places. Let's see. So the practical issues in setting up Allied Up kind of were like a on steroids version of the LVN co-op, designing the bylaws again, and governance and stock decisions, and making all sorts of decisions about the right talent to bring in, the people with the right sort of staffing industry experience are sort of inherently capitalist in a way that's not helpful. And so there was like a really hard period of figuring out the right people with the right skills. And in some ways, I mean, the CEO who was hired is wonderful. She's really talented and she is mission aligned. It was hard to find somebody with those skills. And at the same time, I'd say there's been it's not, and I don't think this is bad, actually, I think it could be really good. There's a little bit of a bifurcation of the staffing function from the governance and democratic structure. And I think the next phase of that to be seen, which is really exciting, is like the training and education and racial equity and board development training and all of that that's going to happen over the course of the next year, through the generous help of a grant. And that will really, it started already. There have been some, we started worker owner trainings that we do once a month. There's one that's with the union, and then there's one that's with an outside co-op consultant who does like democratic workplace engagement. And they're great, but they're not yet part of what will be this kind of bigger project of training and education. And that, I think, that will, I'm so excited about that part. Like the staffing engine is going to run, like not to be, I don't know, kind of nasty about that. Like it's obviously not, my interest is not like a staffing company, but there are people who can do that. That's a skill set, but the piece that is going to be the, hopefully forever embedded values structure of the co-op, that part is starting to live like right now. And I'm really excited about that. And yeah, this, I touched on the labor supply, but I do think there's something key here. This was a long time ago when we were negotiating with Kaiser, and we had this kind of, at the time, somewhat laughable, bizarre idea of like negotiating a non-incumbent workforce trust or nonprofit engine for workers who were outside of the union, to give them meaningful jobs, and to separate. The union had to sort of be agnostic about whether they would come into the union or not, and just say like, there need to be more healthcare workers. There's this looming shortage of an absurd number of healthcare workers that of course now is like way worse. And we need to help fill that. So having an education training partnership is to me a very big piece of Allied Up. Oh, here, I'm not very good at slides, but this is what I was just talking about. Yeah, I thought to put this in just because a lot of times people have questions about just like, how did you do different things? And from the union perspective, like the union can be an incubator until there's an employer. And there's clearly a whole lot of gray area in there, but what we tried to do carefully was to front load costs that were sort of development and theoretical before they were real. So, you know, there are enormous legal costs in setting up like the bylaws stuff. You can use up tons of attorney hours doing that. And a lot of the questions initially that you have to work through and the options, really, it passes the straight face test to say that the union is investing in figuring these questions out, not because we're developing the bylaws of an outside company, but because we want to understand if this is really going to be democratically governed and what it's going to mean for workers. So the union did agree essentially to let me do that for months and months, to use outside help, SEC attorney, a co-op attorney, to really develop these with the set of members who were like the, you know, kind of member entrepreneurs behind, the people who wanted to be on the board and things like that. And I'd say sort of like the line in the sand came when, you know, when you file with the Secretary of State and you have a business entity, and then especially when you start when the board started like interviewing people to hire, that the hiring function is like a key. There is a little bit of litigation around this, and that is a key kind of like union needs to step away moment. Yeah. Okay. So let's see. Yeah, I've covered some of this. We're negotiating the collective bargaining agreement right now, actually, with Allied Up. So Allied Up and SEIU, UHW are negotiating, and we're almost done. The CBA itself, I feel like, is a little bit of a representation of what's both challenging and wonderful about this model. The CBA for the LVNs and what seems like will end up being true at Allied Up too is really different than any other one we have. CBAs can be really like heavy on work rules, you know, and grievance rules and that kind of stuff. And I mean, like sometimes tens and even hundreds of pages of that kind of stuff, which you need to be defensive in a regular capitalist structure. And it basically has almost none of that. So like the LVN CBA is like 5 pages. This will be longer for Allied Up, but and you can look at, you know, examples. There's a number of unionized food co-ops, and I'll give a couple examples actually in a minute. But it's been really useful for me to look at CBAs and bylaws of other unionized co-ops. But on the kind of, you know, plus alignment side, it is really cool to show up to bargaining where everybody has the same incentive, and like the success of the enterprise is the success of the workers and the wealth of the workers. And it's, you know, conversations about benefits are like, you know, what can the enterprise basically afford, and which is the same question as what can like we afford, you know. So it's really interesting, but the alignment is remarkable. So there are, some other examples, and there's like nuances in how some of these are designed that I think are really interesting to pay attention to. And then some like newer innovations around perpetual trust models and things like that, that are other ways at getting around embedding values over time. And I don't know if it's because I've like been in organized labor my whole professional life, but like serious cynicism about you know, infiltration attempts and like turnover attempts. So to try to create something that's kind of buffered against that. So Cooperative Home Care Associates is the biggest union co-op in the country, and the biggest co-op in general in the country. It's home healthcare services. For about, I think they have like 2,300 or so workers, and they're organized by 1199, which is the sister local to us in the Bronx. The Cincinnati Union Co-op Initiative, a lot of people are familiar with, even though it's localized in Cincinnati. It was developed through a steelworkers partnership with Mondragon. And most people know Mondragon. It's a Federation of Worker Co-ops in the Basque region of Spain, and it's the world's largest co-op, industrial co-op. They have 80,000 or 85,000 worker owners, annual sales of $20 billion. They're enormous. And there was an agreement in 2009 between Mondragon and the steelworkers that created the Cincinnati Union Co-op Initiative. So they incubate Mondragon style union worker co-ops. A lot of them are food co-ops, but not all of them. The California Harvesters is like somewhat briefly lived project, but kind of interesting from that trust angle. They're a worker-owned benefit trust. They had 450 members, and they were basically trying to create high-quality farm labor jobs. There's a few other in here. The one that really interests me is the Home Care Workers Purpose Trust in Washington State. They're organized by SEIU 775. This is a really clever trust structure for preserving partly gains of the public authority model. Like they have a whole separate set of issues in the public sector, which had been a bastion of relative strength for the labor movement. And then recently with Janus Supreme Court decision and fair share dues requirements, has seen tons of erosion. And so this was like a really interesting way to, there's all sorts of critiques of this, but to essentially privatize what was a public sector workforce. So Washington State's home care workers had historically been employed by the state for the purposes of collective bargaining, represented by 775, a contract with the state. And the state decided to outsource the program and shift to this private sector workforce. So 775, in response to that, they consulted with worker ownership experts, and they developed this approach that would be worker-centered and preserve bargaining rights and keep in place the core elements of that public authority model. So the Trust for Workers itself is a holding entity, and it co-owns a joint venture with a labor-friendly employer. So the joint venture itself basically applied to administer the state's 40,000 worker consumer-directed home care workers. And they bid on this along with other bidders, and they won the contract with the state. So they represent 40,000 workers. And it's 3 organizations. It's Cooperative Home Care Associates, PHI, which is like an education training arm, and the ICA Group, which is a co-op development firm. They collaborated to design and administer the trust, which is still true right now. And yeah, so that's kind of a cool thing that's happening. I did want to highlight some, like I'm obsessed with how to scale these things. So so I just wanted to touch on like policy and other kind of innovations that I hope can scale worker ownership. Let's see. So this is Worker Owned Recovery California is a policy group, call ourselves the Work Coalition. It was formed about 2 years ago. And so it's represented by state and national experts in worker ownership. I will say I'm the only organized labor person in there, and there should be more. But minus me, it's basically all of the kind of key players in like co-op development, co-op conversion, like that kind of space. And we sort of assembled ourselves a couple of years ago because we saw like that there wasn't really anything being done on scale. And we're focusing on California. So we, we're still really new, but I feel like it's sort of a silly example because it's small, but I've gotten a lot of inspiration for it, and it's growing. We pool our resources to hire a lobbyist, a policy consultant. I'm about to hire somebody onto my staff to have them lent out as a coordinator for this coalition, which is the first time the union has okayed me doing that for somebody who's not being lent to a political campaign. So I take some amount of meaning from that. So we're our resources are kind of building. We had like a budget play this past year, and we're working with folks at like the Workforce Development Board to try to a lot of it is education and training, and then both with like small business owners thinking about conversion, but more so with the state, to try to get, there are some what seem like minutia fixes that are actually so meaningful in how co-ops can access the same sorts of resources that non-cooperatively owned enterprises have access to. So like stuff that's embedded in the small business administration language, a lot of stuff around insurance, which becomes almost immediately impossible if you're trying to tell a bank or an insurer that you're owned by 100 people equally. Like they do not want to talk to you. So anyway, there are fixes that we're like that we're really focused on making together. And so I'm excited about that. And I do think just coalition work in general is kind of like key. The Cooperative Economy Act is legislation that I developed in California starting a couple years ago. It's finally kind of moving a little bit more. The idea here is to incentivize the use of cooperatively owned labor pools and position democratically owned workforce pools as employers of record, primarily for misclassified gig workers, but it doesn't necessarily have to just be. The thought here is that labor market intermediaries are becoming more common. They're completely inevitable with AB5 requiring big gig companies to employ workers appropriately and not misclassify them. So certainly those companies are going to pop up their own kind of crappy low road versions of labor market intermediaries. So we were trying to get ahead of that. And it's happening in healthcare. Allied Up, initially when I started developing this legislation, the idea was that there be a healthcare worker staffing co-op, and that now exists in Allied Up. So if we had our best day, in my mind, we would, this legislation would come to be, and Allied Up would become the cooperative labor contractor for healthcare labor. The idea is basically there's what we call cooperative labor contractors, which is like for any industry, you can create a cooperatively owned pool of workers that have such scale that they can then negotiate with companies. And platform companies say all the time that they don't want their platforms, they don't want to be employers. So great, let's separate those things. Yeah, I don't need, maybe not too much more detail on that, but I think there's avenues for this and other legislation that could really create incentive schemes to use democratically owned labor over other labor. Let's see. Might skip a little bit. So I think there is something happening kind of currently that's meaningful, both from inside and outside organized labor. I don't think I'm alone in noticing intensified interest in worker ownership. I do think there's kind of a semantics and language problem that I come against a lot, which is like, a little deeper than this, but some version of that co-ops sound kind of like hippie small enterprises, and people associate them with something that's usually not useful when we're talking about scale. But regardless, there seems to be renewed interest and a set of ideas and concepts emerging, like platform cooperatives and things like that, cooperatively owned data trusts that are really, really thoughtful. And I think during the pandemic too, this interest has kind of blown up. I'm of course particularly interested in the role of organized labor in this world. Yeah. Let's see. Okay, I was going to close out on a fun story. So I wanted to just end on this fun story because not just in my professional, but now also my personal life, I'm obsessed with co-ops. So the doggy daycare where I take my dogs are on the left there. They announced very suddenly that after 22 years that they were going to close. And this is like a really nice, somewhat high-end doggy daycare. So they employ 75 handlers. They're actually like decent jobs, and people who are obsessed with their dogs are also care a lot about the people who take care of them when they're on vacations or whatever. So anyway, so the owner announced that she was suddenly going to close, and another a friend of mine who also takes her dog there, so another consumer of the business, and I and the two managers decided we should try to see if we could turn this into a hybrid or solidarity co-op, like I described at the beginning, where the workers and the consumers could co-own it and buy it from the owner, instead of her doing what she wanted to do, which was obviously just sell the real estate. It was going to most likely be turned into high-end housing. It's in West Oakland. So very long story short, there's a somewhat affluent consumer base there. There's a lot of people who take their dogs who work in Silicon Valley, and so we appealed to them. I put my organizer hat on. We appealed to people to raise what I described earlier as the Class B stock, non-voting stock, and we raised $3.5 million to purchase the real estate and the business assets. And there were 3 other bidders, and the co-op entity won. So it's now called, it was called Every Dog Has Its Daycare. It's called the Dog Social Club Cooperative. If you have a dog in Oakland, you should take your dog there. You can become a member. And it's kind of like a fluffy story, but also, it's been really personally invigorating for me, and it's really moving how into it people are. So anyway, I wanted to end on that fun little story.